In this video, I want to solve the same problem as usual, where I have multiple answers in the same column, and I have a list of multiple correct answers. This time I want to solve it using VBA. I want to solve the problem using a user-defined function, that way you can reuse the code in other workbooks. In order to use a function, we need to create a new module which will house the function. Because if you store it inside of the sheet or the workbook, it simply won't work. In order to test the function, I'll first create a helper sub that will simply be used in order to test it. That way it's a bit easier. This function is simply going to call my function, which I haven't written yet, but I'll call it count correct answers. This function is going to take 3 arguments, the cell that has the answers, and I'm just going to use the active cell because this sub is only for testing. Then I need a separator. That's another reason why I want to create a function. That way you can change the separator based on what is actually used in the cell. I'm going to hardcode it as a semicolon for testing purposes. Lastly, I need to refer to this table which has my correct answers, and I have named that TBL best wrappers, which means I can refer to it in the range function. I'm assuming that I'm in the correct sheet when I call this sub, so I don't have to reference this sheet one. I'll simply write range TBL best wrappers, and then the column name is best wrappers. It won't work if I call it now, of course, because I actually have to create this function. Like I said, it will take 3 arguments, which is a range. In other words, you'll type in the function and click the correct cell. And the delimiter is going to be a string. And lastly, the correct answers will also be a range. This way you have more flexibility and it's easier to reuse the function in another scenario. I want the function to spit out an integer, that way you can have negative points in case you want to punish people for making a lot of wrong answers. I first want to convert my answers, the range, into a text string, in other words, extract this text. I also want a looper variable, and I want to count the number of answers and the count of correct answers. And lastly, also the number of points, which is what the function will spit out. Points has to be integer, because you can get a negative number of points. Technically, count answers and count correct could both be byte, assuming you have fewer than 255 answers, which I think is a fair assumption. But I'm going to keep them as integer, because otherwise I'll get an error, which I will show later. Like I said, I first want to extract the answer text, which is then grabbing the value from my answer. Because my answer is a range, I don't have to write .value, but I think it makes it easier to understand what's going on. As I did in the Power Query solutions, I want to remove any delimiter at the end, meaning I first want to check if the last character is the separator, and if so, I want to remove it. I'll say if the rightmost character of my answer text is equal to my delimiter, then I want to remove it. Meaning my answer text will be set equal to itself minus the rightmost character, meaning I'll use the left function to grab everything except for the length minus 1. That way you remove the rightmost character. Now I've removed the separator at the end in case there is one. Now I can start the loop, because I need to do a lookup for each correct answer, because this is based on the simple solution from Power Query, which was the list transform solution. Meaning I will loop through each correct answer in the correct answers list and check whether I can find that in the text string. I'll start out by saying that you have no correct answers, and then loop through each correct answer. This is why I wanted loop answers to be arranged, because I can do it for each loop, saying that for each cell inside of this multi-cell range. Here I want to use the inString function, which simply does a lookup saying, can I find this string within another string? So if in string, I want position 1, because I want to start at the start of the text string, and the string I'm looking into is my answer text, and the string I'm trying to find is then the loop answers.value, and I want to use VB text compare in order to compare text. InString will return a number, which is the position I found my text in. I can then ask if this is greater than 0, then that means I can actually find the text string. Then I can set count correct to be equal to itself plus 1. I'm going to do this if statement in one sentence, because I think it's clear enough what it does. I also forgot to count the actual number of answers given, which as shown before is simply the number of separators plus 1, because you have a separator between each answer, meaning you need to add 1. I'll start out by adding the 1 so I don't forget it. In order to count the number of answers, I can say 1 plus the count of separators, because I know there's a separator between each answer. Unfortunately, I haven't figured out how to use text select like I can in Power Query, where I could remove everything except for the separator. Instead, I'll say 1 plus the entire text string minus the text string after I've removed the separator, which is kind of the reverse way to do it, but it works. I want the length of my answer text that I haven't changed. Then I want to find length of my answer text after I've replaced the separator with nothing. Now I already have the count of answers and I have the count of correct. which means the number of points is then equal to the number of correct answers minus the count of answers minus count correct. Because the number of wrong answers is then the total number of answers minus the correct answers. Lastly, I have to say that the function should spit out the points as its output, and I can now test it. I can call it like any other function by writing the name. Unfortunately, I don't get IntelliSense. I have to know the correct order, meaning I first want the cell with my answers, then I want the separator, which is a string, so I wrap it in quotation marks, and then I need to select the correct answers. And then autofill will spit it out. In the first row, I have one correct answer and one wrong answer, meaning my points is 1 minus 1, so 0, that's correct. The Smiths is wrong, NF is one correct answer and no wrong answers, and then we have minus 7 here. So this spits out what we expect. And this is not that many lines of code. It's a very easy solution. Lastly, I want to show that if I make count answers and count correct bytes, it's going to give an error. And it would help if I wrote byte and not bytes. In this case, the Smiths is going to be negative. That's why I also wanted this call sub. So I can now test why does this give a value error. And if we step through it using F8, I can see that here, after I've done the loop where I calculate the number of points, we can see I have no correct answers and I have one answer, which means that in this calculation I have 0 minus, in parentheses, 1 minus 0, and this is going to give an overflow error. What made it so confusing for me is that byte allows the value of 0, there's no problem here, but byte does not allow negative values. And if we highlight this portion, it will say that count answers minus count correct is 1, but if I highlight the whole thing, it's going to say it gives me an error, because count correct is 0, and I'm saying 0 minus 1, and even though points is an integer, which does allow negative values, for some reason, if you have a calculation using 2 bytes, and the output is a negative value or greater than 255, this is going to give an overflow error, and it confused me for a while, because this should be allowed, because I'm not actually storing a negative value inside of a variable that is of type byte, but for some reason this simply isn't allowed. And I don't know enough about computers to explain why that is. All I know is that if I make the data types integer, then I'm allowed to do this calculation. So if we repeat the same calculation, so now the data types are integer, we can see that the same calculation is allowed. Once again, I have 1 and I have 0. The math is then 0 minus 1, but this time I'm allowed to do the calculation. Even though it's fine to use byte to store 0 and 1, for some reason, when you do math with variables that are of type byte and the calculation ends up being outside of the range of what is allowed in byte, to summarize, when you have a calculation where the output of the calculation is outside of the range of allowed values for your data type, you will have to change the data type. Even though the variable can contain the individual numbers, because the math ends up being outside the range, it will crash. And that's why I need them to be integer, so that they can allow negative values. You could also decide that in case the number of wrong answers is greater than the number of correct answers, then the point should output 0. That would also solve the problem, but that was a design decision you could make. In order to fix the value error, I simply have to update the calculations, and now we're back at the start. So